Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the HR Huddle. I'm your host, Teri Zipper, CEO and Managing Partner at Sapient Insights Group, and we're back for another exciting episode of HR We Have a Problem. This is the show where we break down the big and most relevant HR issues of the day. We help you make sense of what they mean for you, and we talk about what you might do about them. Joining me today is Sean Luitjens, VP Product at Korn Ferry. Welcome, Sean.
Hey, how's it going? Although there's a lot of pressure now to have an exciting episode.
Yes, there is. That is a disadvantage to having a conversation before the episode starts, as you realize all the stuff you weren't planning to do. So you've had a lot going on the last 14 years since you and I worked together. What have you been up to?
Yeah, so I try not to talk about all the different roles, but basically I've been around talent acquisition and comp and ben, total rewards, anything around there, building software, working on partner ecosystems, those type of places. And so really, how can we help comp departments, HR departments, and everything pay or remunerate and attract and retain the best talent? So, and it's all been on the software side, solving problems for companies. Just like to tell you, the one job I haven't done, nor do I have any interest, is being an HR practitioner. That just sounds really hard to have to deal with employees while trying to solve problems.
Exactly. And I loved the way you said remunerate. That word is really hard to say. And a lot of people, I think, don't go into HR because they can't say that word. So we did a very popular episode on pay transparency earlier this year. And I wanted to follow up to that and kind of weave in this discussion on pay equity, especially in light of the European Parliament voting in favor of adopting the EU's pay transparency directive to try to further narrow that pay gap, and just sort of following in what they're doing in North America. Although I think these are very different. Does that sound like a good plan to you?
Sure. I'm always down to, dig on pay transparency and pay equity. And, it's just so much more complicated than people think. And I know, most episodes go about a half an hour, give or take, could spend all day probably talking about it.
Yeah. Let's see what we can squeeze in. So let's get into the huddle. All right. So I usually like to start with a definition, because I like to set the terms for people, kind of, what is it that we're talking about with respect to pay equity, and then maybe what your definition of pay transparency is, and how how the two are different.
Okay. You want to set the definition? You want me to take a crack at it?
I'm going to let you take a crack at what you think it is, so that as we set the stage for the conversation, I know how you're thinking about it.
Okay. So, pay transparency, I think there's two avenues to pay transparency. So I think the news has been about the external pay transparency. So for job postings, those type of items, what is the range of pay that's out there? The other piece that's probably less talked about, and I think probably companies want to tackle later rather than sooner, will be the internal pay equity. And so, if you're inside a company, and whether that goes down to the actual dollar or ranges on a chart or something like that, but starting to show what people make inside the company compared to each other, which then starts to blend into the pay equity piece. So the pay transparency at a high level for me is really, how are you sharing that out in the market? And we'll talk a little bit about how complex that gets really fast, because I think on all of the things around pay transparency right now, it's all about base pay. And so obviously those that are in pay realize that you don't generally just measure things on base pay. And so it gets complicated around, well, what am I actually including when I talk about pay transparency? And then that bleeds over into pay equity. So are you marrying those two up to be an apples to apples comparison? And you have pay equity. And so for me, pay equity is probably easier to define. It's really just, are we paying people in the same role at the same performance, which I'll add in there, regardless of, background, race, religion, gender, et cetera, for that role. And the thing that, I don't know where you want to start, Teri, but the thing that always is really interesting to me is you have pay equity. And I haven't spoken to anybody who says they don't want to be a fair payer yet. on purpose, basically saying you should pay everyone the same for that role. And then for years, we've talked about, well, how do you pay for performance and differentiate pay with a limited merit budget? And so I need to give different people different money based on their pay, which is at complete odds with pay equity.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, do you see the whole idea of merit pay? Where do you see that going?
Yeah, for me, it's going to be about technology and having a really good system to start the process. And then how do you remediate the pay equity? And by remediate, so that's my two words that I had to use today, Teri, were remunerate and remediate. I was in the R's today in my word of the day calendar. How do you remediate that? Because the other interesting part about pay equity is it's a moving target. A lot of projects that you have in HR, if you have someone come in and help you look at the problem, you then put a solution in place and you have it, and theoretically you stick inside those guardrails and you're fine. Pay equity, by definition, you hire the next person, someone leaves, someone gets promoted, all those things change, and it's a moving target all the time. And so the remediation of pay equity is an ongoing affair, which means I think, we get into technology, and obviously I'm a nerd, so I like to use the technology side of things. But back to your question around pay for performance, I think you've got to be able to track those items. So not just the pay pieces, and we can get into the pay pieces, but then the performance aspects, because you have to be able to define why, Teri is making more money than Sean is for the exact same role. And is it performance based? Is it scope based? So I know you've had job evaluation people on. So you've talked about, well, what is the exact same role? How do you make sure that you've got them in the same grade for the same role? Is the scope different? So really creating a defensible position to say why people might be paid differently in a one-to-one comparison.
Yeah. And then you've got that sort of explained pay gap and then the unexplained pay gap, which I think is where some of the EU stuff is really directed at. And, I think they're actually looking at requiring you to mitigate anything that's 5% or greater, right? From a pay gap perspective, which is interesting because there's the laws that have come about in the US, but they're all very different by state. So everything, you really have to be in tune with this stuff to kind of understand what's happening and how you're going to mitigate it in your organization.
Well, 5% of what? Right. So if you and I are paid, if we're same performance, I mean, I can't keep up with you, Teri, but if I was able to attain the same performance level as you for doing the same role, and we're paid the same on base salary, short-term incentives were the same, and they gave you 500 shares for doing such a great job, and they gave me 5,000 shares, are we still paid equitably?
Right.
And how do you track that, right? Because I'm sure you would argue no. And then how do you track those? How do you value those? Is it when they're cashed out? I mean, there's a lot of different issues. And as you know, not going into too much depth, some countries handle shares or options differently as well. And so how do you start to track these items for companies that are in multiple locations?
Yeah. Do you think that they've been specific enough to go down to that level of detail? Because I've not really seen that.
No, I think pay equity right now is gender on base pay, right? That's kind of the reporting, the legal reporting piece. And that's what you actually see. Base pay is typically what you see in pay transparency as well. And kind of moving back to pay transparency, I think it's going to be interesting to watch is you've seen these ads, right? That are, we pay between $50,000 and $500,000 for a role. I do think the government will start to rein that in, but I think there'll be some people that are pretty smart about this too in the recruiting side. And so let's say we take a cybersecurity analyst at $125,000 and the government says, well, you can have some delta on either side of that. And so the company might say it's $115,000 to $140,000. But if you're smart about it, what if I do total remuneration? And so I do the same type job description at my company versus your company, and I add everything up and say, well, this job pays between 180 and 200 total remuneration. Which one are you going to apply for?
Yeah.
And so I do think there'll be some gamesmanship, not just in this initial gamesmanship we've seen is, well, I'm going to abide by the rules, but not abide by the rules. I think companies will get much smarter about what's out there.
Yeah. Well, hopefully they spend their time trying to figure out how to do it right and not how to game the system, right?
Well, I mean, HR for a long time in the talent acquisition space, I do think ranges, if used right, I think, you're always trying to get the best candidates. Think about the bonus side of, I'm not going to get candidates that are, too junior or too senior for the role. And so now I can go through the process and get candidates that really do match up for the role, hopefully hire for the best available role. Now, where they get that pay data is another issue, right? How they come up with that range, that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother day. Exactly. But I do think it's super helpful for the companies long-term to be able to show that. And then, of course, how does that get reflected back to the internal employees that are inside the company? If you're just going to show external range, do you go ahead and show internal range as well? Where does that slot in?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of downstream impacts that organizations need to figure out, because that internal piece is going to become pretty significant pretty quickly, right? As this starts to evolve. What do you think? Just on a different topic, a different question around this topic. How do you think this impacts the ability to negotiate pay these days? I mean, and who has the upper hand here?
I mean, it's interesting. And for who, I would ask, is it you talking about the job candidates, or are you talking about internal people when it comes around to, time for merit increases or changes or roles? There's a really interesting article by Zoe Collin and Bobby Person that's out there that I can probably send if you want to put up somewhere. It's, it's like 50 pages, a lot of math, but really their beginning and the end, if you want to read the English part, is about how it's going to compress pay, and the average worker is going to end up over time making 2% less. Because you can't, if you go out to your, if I go and say, I need more money, I'm looking what's out there, they can say, well, I can't do that because Teri is going to see that you are also making more. And so they feel that they're going to get hemmed in, or they can use it as an excuse being out there. And that comes back to that technology piece. I think companies that are able to show that, look, Teri's a high performer, Sean's a, low to mid-level performer. And so, at that point, we can have a pay differentiation. I also think that internal pay equity piece around that's going to need to look over time. So if you look at a snapshot of time, you look at the picture right now, it's going to show you one picture, but you might show that people of a certain gender, race, et cetera, are moving through the ranges faster. And so it might look like someone is, or one variable is moving through and is underpaid, but they're just getting promoted faster, moving through the range. So if you look over a period of 5 or 10 years, you might find that actually on a like for like basis, they're making more. So, when you're stuck in the range, obviously you get your, whatever your merit increase. And usually if you're stuck in the range, you're probably not a high performer, right? Because you're not getting promoted. So you're moving at your 1%, 2%, 3% a year. That over time works out. You end up pretty high in the range, close to red lighted, going back to your Mercer days in comp. You get red lighted. Meanwhile, somebody moves up through the range and they might only be at 40% in the range, but they are going to then move to the next range and be at 40. And so when you look at them like for like, they're going to look like they're behind, but they're actually, if you look at them over a 5-year period, they're making more.
Yeah. And that's where the tech comes in. I mean, it's the budget's still the budget at the end of the day. And, you gotta pay the bills. So you got to figure out how you'll pay for this. And you can't really bring people in at the low end and expect them to make any progress through the range at these 2% and 3% salary increases that have basically dominated the last 8-10 years. So promotion is kind of the real, the big thing that will move you through the range faster, right?
Well, and you're going to get pushback between talent acquisition and HR, right? Or comp. So talent acquisition wants to find a best available player for that job. That's what they're paid for, right? And so they're going to be perpetually pushing the top of that range to try to get someone in. And, if you hire an A player, in theory, you're paying an A salary. And so you're going to have to either show that internally or people are going to see that. And so how do you deal with that issue as well? Because HR is inside, or the line manager is like, well, now what did you do? Right? Or are we going to end up in a place where, and this is where some of that article talks about, if you do hire a high performer, they might get red lighted by default because I legally might have to start having everyone else catch up. And that's where this remediation, in a 30 minutes or, an hour is, having experts that come in and help. And, I know enough to be dangerous, but when you talk about some type of consultant, talk about the best way to remediate this and look down the road, because it is a highly complex issue. If you do hire an A player, in the old days, you get super excited and you'd be like, she's awesome. She's coming in, she's going to help us. And now there's a little bit of that, oh crap moment that you look back and say, well, A, how do I keep her? And B, how do I migrate other people's salary up in the market to make sure that I don't have any other issues?
Right. Yeah. There's getting to be far too much math in HR. Stacy and I talked about this on a prior episode. It's like I went into HR because there was less math, and now I have to do math all the time.
Well, I mean, pay equity, I mean, the way to do it the right way, and this is where, again, as a tech nerd, we're hopefully building tools, and there's several tools out there around pay equity where you can get that in there so that you can, again, whether you're taking the log or you're doing multivariate regression or whatever you're doing, you just put the data in, you look at it, and you set some limits, and kind of work through. And then how do I, now I can see the problem. And then, what kind of help do I need to help remediate that? Or am I actually in line? I've been a fair payer. But basically, where do I go find help to figure that out?
Yeah. Do you see in organizations kind of a new niche group evolving? Because in the past, I mean, recruiters are the ones out in front. They need to know pay for purposes of, onboarding people. Comp, I would say, at least in my days in comp, they didn't really focus on pay equity. That was somebody else's job, right? They were more doing benchmarking and overall the market pricing, but they weren't looking at the data, especially on the internal side. If somebody needed to do a pay equity analysis, they brought consultants in, and, they weren't necessarily sitting with the comp team, right? Do you see that evolving and kind of a new group within HR that really focuses in this area? Or
I think if you're lucky to be big enough, Teri, that you might have, the DE&I group to sit inside of DE&I. I think comp has now been expanded out because obviously you have to collect all the comp elements and then add whatever type of variables you want to measure against. So I don't think comp can escape, but I think it really goes to that, additional items that somewhere in HR is getting tackled with this, right? And so if you're big enough to have a DE&I group or someone that DE&I, and I think it's going to go back to your staffing, or you have people who are passionate about this, or people have to get it done. And small midcos, how far down does this get pushed on the legislation side? If you've got 100 people, I think there's a couple of complexities. 100, 200 people, one, you're not going to hire 2 or 3 people to take care of DE&I initiatives, and you're going to have to find software that works for you, et cetera. And secondly, with my, math dork hat on, the numbers get really small. And so when you start talking about doing regression analysis on 200, 400, 500 employees, depending on the size of a department or the size of a range or a band, you have to start adding things on, and it just becomes actually more complicated for someone who's an HR generalist trying to deal with other parts of their day job.
Yeah.
So I think I think it's just another complexity that's out there. I do think for the small, mid-sized companies, a nice cool thing is, if you're in HR, you have visibility across the whole company. You start thinking about these big companies that have multiple divisions and multiple areas. I mean, a complex issue becomes even more complex, which again, how you remediate that. I mean, the hard part is if you hired a project for other issues in the past, you kind of get it done. You take a picture of it and you're like, this is what we got to do for the next 5 years. How do you remediate something that's also a moving target? So it's not like you can even say, well, over the next year or 2 years, we're going to go ahead and we're going to make these changes. That assumption would be that nobody leaves the company, joins the company, nothing changes. You don't acquire any divisions, you don't divest the division, and all of a sudden the target moves again. And so that ongoing piece to remediation, along with your other DE&I initiatives, makes it a really challenging thing to deal with.
Yeah. Do you think the technology is moving fast enough to keep up with this? I mean, I feel like with the way this whole thing is starting to transpire and the laws are getting in place, it's a very expensive proposition to bring, somebody in to do a pay equity analysis. And as you said, it's only as good as the day it was written. Yeah. So, that we're going to have to look to technology to help organizations do this. And then they're going to have people inside the organization who know how to interpret the results. But some of that, I think, is going to have to be done by the technology. And obviously with machine learning and that kind of thing, hopefully it can help us do some of that, right?
Yeah, I think there'll be 2 avenues. I think the obvious one is you have somebody come in and take a look at it, and they have or are partnered with some enabling technology and take a look at it and say, here's the situation. And, here's how it might remediate things, set up your guardrails, put it all in the technology, and you can look at it, and then they can come help you look at it on some period of time, right? That's one. The other will just be the inverse. You get some technology, you upload the information, if you're lucky, you don't have it, but I think most people will find out they kind of have an oh crap moment somewhere inside their company, getting that in, and then you just get some advice there. And I think there will be a lot of people that blossom up and deal with that. I think in the large companies, there'll be these experts that come out over time. I mean, there just will be the technologies there, and that'll be their role, and they'll be really good at it. Still maybe need some help, as they go, but small and mid-cos, you're going to need that help. And to whatever level you need that help, it'll be kind of a gig economy for whatever type of consultant you have, or there'll be consultants. I think it'll pop up around there, but finding people who've been doing this for a while right now, I think that's going to be critical for companies to kind of set that forward. And then to your point, lean into technology so that you don't have to restart the project. As you've been in software. The last thing you want to do is, re-implement over and over again. What you'd like to do is have the data in a system, that you're managing your pay equity analysis in. You can continue to look at that and update it, but you never have to re-implement. You just either realize you have a problem or change gears. Remediation is you think about it, everyone talks about remediation, but there's really only one way that people have talked about remediating a pay equity issue. Nobody talks about lowering somebody's pay. Right. So the only way you make it equitable is potentially adding money. And I think that's part of this issue with companies struggling to deal with it or kicking the can down the road to do it. I mean, it's a really rough place, I think, for leadership to be in. How do you tackle this issue? It's a big, complex public issue, and the way you tackle it with is money. Meanwhile, you're trying to make a profit.
Yeah. I remember a couple of years ago when some of this really started to heat up, there were some companies that jumped out in front and said, hey, we're, raising all the pay. At the time, it was mostly focused on women and pay equity. Obviously, we know that cuts across other areas, but, they raised the pay of all the women in these positions, which I thought was interesting because, it's like, okay, what analysis did they do? I mean, it all just sort of happened so fast. I wonder, I'd be curious to know what the impact of that is now, and if they feel like they did the right thing, and did they look at this and the level of depth that they needed to sort of fix the situation.
Well, and like you mentioned, if you have the technology to look at it, right, the comp tools, and you have the pay equity tools, and you want to, work towards solving that, it's a longer haul. I think it'd be great if people had. I just don't know if it's that tenable, the amount of money to just throw at it 1 year and then we're equitable. But you came from comp. That's an annuitized now additional expense, right? So that just sits on there forever. You can't send a one-time payment to solve it this year, and then it's a problem next year. And I think that's part of the complexity. Again, it's, if you go way down to the employee level, every one of those items is moving.
Yeah, everything's a moving target right now with the economy the way that it is, right?
Well, and that's base pay. So again, if you have, short-term incentives, long-term incentives, if you allow kind of flexible rewards and allow people to move things out of benefits and into base pay, or base pay into benefits, or base pay into long-term incentives, you start allowing them to move the shell game in total rewards, flexible rewards to fit their lifestyle. Then now you really have to lean into technology, because where are you tracking all those items? Otherwise, on a base pay basis, you might look like you're not paying equitably, but you might be. You're just allowing the employees more flexibility.
Right. Yeah. The best way to get around laws is to come up with new ways to pay people, right? Like, isn't that how benefits got started back in like the 30s or 40s, where they had caps on pay? So they just started adding benefits. Right. Well,
contrary to popular opinion, Teri, I wasn't around then. So.
Oh, I thought we'd been in this business for a long time.
Not quite that long, but that is, how do you, and from, our days together, the value, what do you value benefits at? And is there going to be, and I think there will be some gamesmanship as companies go out there and try to figure it out. But I also think companies it's an honest struggle. How do I pull my numbers together from multiple places? And how do I put a value on it that is fair and honest to the employees? That's a big ask for companies to kind of put that together. I think they'll be able to grab the variables around pay equity. And I think that on a base pay, they'll be able to do pay transparency. I do think companies will go there. And I firmly believe companies do want to be fair payers for the most part. It's just absolutely more complicated. And, you hire one person at a time. That's the best way to hire. You hire the best person for the job. And, now you can't look at that in a vacuum anymore. You've got to start to look at that in a larger holistic picture, or the ramifications of that.
Yeah, no, I agree. People want to do the right thing. The question is, what is that going to look like, and how do you keep up with it? Because again, like done things in a number of states. This is evolving. Every jurisdiction has got something slightly different. So it's almost like, do you just take the worst case scenario and just apply that everywhere in these organizations? Or do you really try to understand at the level of complexity and detail that you need to by jurisdiction? Especially now with, I don't know if you think the hybrid work, remote work, but I can see that obviously having a big impact, right? I work for the company in New York City, but I don't sit in the New York City office, right?
Well, and the pay, how do you define, how do you compare someone who's working in, Florida, in northern Florida at their rate, and someone who's in New York City or the Valley, right? So you're talking California rates in a higher tax area. What is fair pay for that role, and how does that align with the corporate strategy to either pay with a national headquarters or a local pay rate? And hybrid actually makes it worse, I think, from the standpoint, the complexity worse around, well, they have to live there to be hybrid. So how do you deal with that from a pay equity issue if someone's remote in Florida? Again, all these issues, I think you have to lean into technology and be able to move those levers up and down, because you're right. I think if you think about putting that in Excel or writing a Word document out and start thinking about just doing that for 10 people in Excel, that gets very difficult. And then the other piece is going to be, how do you decide how other people are handling that right now? And I think as tools start to gather more data and have more and more clients, they'll start to have some prevalence information and can share that. But right now, I think, there are, the consultants that are out there in the space, or people that have dealt with this have seen enough of them to give you a little bit of prevalence of like, do I have a problem? How do I remediate the problem? Until there's enough people on board for the tech tools to align with the consulting side.
Yeah. I hope people were taking a shot every time you said one of those hard words that we talk about. Like you said, remediate. I don't know how many times it's one of those shot words.
Should
right?
I go with fix? Fix, solve. Solve is a good one. We can go with solve.
I'm just kidding. I think it's hilarious though. And we get on these, we've got these specific words. Some of these words are hard to say. Say that 3 times, right? Where do you think things like livable wage and kind of the CEO ratio fit into this mix? I know a lot of that's been swirling around. And
yeah, I think livable wage at some point, I think it'll start to work its way up. I think once you've got, pay equity handled, that same system would be able to put in a livable wage line of what you could do. And then maybe the remediation is the same. Defining livable wage is, that's a whole nother day's worth of topics of who gets to define livable wage. What is a livable wage? What does that mean? But I do think that data can then be incorporated into a system and a tool to basically say, well, where do I have these problems and how fast do I get there? Right. Same problem. I mean, usually the monetary scale per employee is probably lower, but the volume is higher. And so how do you deal with that? So I don't buy into the line that it's a small problem, right? So a lot of times it looks like a small problem because it might be a $3 an hour wage, but you multiply that across a fair number of employees and any corresponding benefits that trail with that, et cetera. And it becomes a pretty big number in a hurry. So it's not an inconsequential problem for a company to tackle. Yeah. But I think once people can get to that point and have the technology to be able to do that across multiple places, you'll get there. On the CEO side, I mean, I typically punt a little bit on that. I think, is the CEO worth that or not? I'm probably not that person to say whether that happens, whether social pressure pushes on that or not. The only analogy I've used in the past is, if I told you could give me $1 and I'll give you 3 back, would that be worth it to you? And if I told you give me $100, would you give me 3 million back? Which one would you take? And so I do think there are CEOs that may or may not be worth that money, and everyone has to look at each situation individually. I think I think that one's actually much tougher. It'll be interesting in the social market. The numbers are staggering, obviously, and they never take the average example. They have to find a ginormous example, right, on the media.
Yeah. My dad's example of that always, growing up, he said to me one day, if I gave you a penny a day, if I gave you a penny today and I doubled it every day for 30 days, would you work for me? And, so I'll leave people to do that math. But trust me, you would take that bet every day. One other thing, just before we kind of start closing this off, I'm just thinking about the education on this. I feel like there's a huge gap in educating the people in the organization, because it's not just the recruiters and, the comp team and HR that's got this responsibility. I mean, at the end of the day, managers need to understand the impact of this and how they go about acquiring the best talent, how they're going to manage that within their budgets and, get the productivity they need to run their piece of the business. I think there's kind of a gap there in educating people in the organization about what all this means. Do you see anything happening there? Anybody doing anything interesting on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how you roll that out. I mean, that's one of those. I'm glad it's not me. So you think about it, the hiring manager and the talent acquisition person, depending on the structure, right, is going to be given a range. They're going to try to hire the best person they can, which might be high in the range. And the hiring manager has a problem at hand that they want to tackle, and they want the best possible person for their own well-being and the company's well-being to do that job. So they end up hiring in the range. And now what? Right? Does that person leave because they kind of get as we mentioned, get red lighted? What about the rest of my employees? If we've got internal pay transparency, someone's been there 10 years doing a good job, they're going to have a what the hell moment. Do I go out and test the market? It's a really difficult problem now. And so I think that education piece on paper sounds like it's pretty simple, but they've got day jobs, so I'm you and I you come from comp and ben nerds. This is the stuff I think is super cool. How do you figure this out? What's the ramification? What's going to happen to the marketplace as you hire in? Is it going to increase or decrease churn? That all, kind of gets us excited. Maybe that sounds like I'm super boring, but that, what gets me excited. And then, but a hiring manager or, if you're in an engineering firm, she just wants to go out and do engineering things and make the best possible product for the company and what have you. And all of a sudden they're hit with this HR item as they're coming in. And so how does compensation make themselves available? How does compensation have tools to model that out? What it looks like if I hire, what the next 2 years might look like. I mean, we're not used to looking at comp that way. You get a merit matrix, you hand out a merit matrix and you're like, fine. It's fine. Teri now makes even more money than Sean did. That's fine. I can rationalize that in my head and it goes off. They don't have to worry about me running into the office and explaining that. And it can create some, depends on the management style. I think there's a great opportunity there, the blue sky altruistic kind of rainbows and unicorns scenario for, me to go into my manager and say, why is Teri making more? On paper, that's a great discussion, right? Well, here's the ways you can perform more. Do we really want to tackle those discussions over and over again? Probably not. Those aren't fun discussions in general, right? Depending on the people over and over again. And like I said, if the engineer, she's just wanted to do the best thing possible in her job, engineering, she doesn't want a part of that.
Yeah. I think it's very conceptual. Yeah. I think it's more of a conceptual thing for not to understand every nuance and how to calculate it, but just sort of, it starts to become a cultural thing within the organization, right? And people need to understand, because I think a lot of people have these definitions of pay equity and pay transparency in their head that don't match reality. So I think
and I think pay equity is the common, if you ask the person, most people pay equity to be paid the same for the same job. But as I said, at the beginning, you want to differentiate pay for performance. If you're a high performer, what do you do if if I can do average work and get paid the same as doing excellent work, what happens? And so I do think it's tough. And I do think comp, whoever's handling that will be in the middle of that. Comp will get asked questions. What is the range? Do they tighten the range of those roles to basically keep that from happening?
Yeah. So as we wrap things up here, do you have any particular guidance for people or any suggestions, sort of any immediate actions people can take to sort of start to get their heads around this?
Yeah. I mean, for me, define if you want to be a fair payer. And then I think it's just starting to really work through and figure out how you're going to collect the data, what you're going to analyze, and start to have some remediation discussions. I think the good news in some ways is I don't think, unless you have a huge situation, it's a long-term plan, having a plan in place. A lot of the legislation hasn't talked so much about remediation, because I have to say the word one more time, or having a plan to solve the complex problem. So I think having that plan and working your way there is key. And then start investigating, the experts that are out there in the space. If you want to tackle it now, find some experts out in the space and have those discussions. And there are tools out there to start getting it in place and looking at those tools and at least talking with them. You don't have to put them in place right away if you're ready or not, but start figuring out what those tools will allow you to look at in your company.
Yeah. But the reality is you're running out of time. Your runway's getting short on getting to the point where you really have a handle on what you want to do in this area and how you're going to manage it.
Yeah. And, and I guess there's some high level, scruples questions. Do you want to be a complete and fair payer? Do you want to, be a legislative fair payer and just follow the minimum guidelines? And actually the ostrich method probably still works for another couple of years. I don't know I have a problem. I don't have a problem because I don't know I have a problem for a little while until I have to fix it. And so we are in that really interesting time, I think, Teri, where companies have all those options. But at the end of the day, I think it's time to start, whatever you pick, I guess not the ostrich method, but to start doing your research to figure out what does this mean for us? What is, how are we want to measure inside our company? What are the comp elements we use? What can we get our arms around? What do we want to look at? And start to, what systems do we have in place to be able to tackle this when we're good and ready to tackle it? Otherwise, to your point, it's going to be a fire drill at the end. And anyone who's been around technology knows that's gathering up all this information, putting it in, looking at the data, analyzing it, getting some experts to help me look at it. That's not a 1 week solution.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, Sean, you and I could probably go on for another hour on this topic, but I think that's about all the time we have today. Thanks for joining me. It was a great conversation. Where can people find you online and on social if you're writing about some of these topics?
LinkedIn's probably the easiest. With Luitjens, I'm super easy to find. So pretty easy to find there, or just Sean.Luitjens at kornferry.com.
Perfect. Well, I want to, thank you. Thank our producers, Brand Method Media Group, and our marketing team who's going to put all this together, make us sound great. And you, the audience, thank you for tuning in. That's all the time we have today for this episode. If you liked it and you enjoyed it, subscribe on your favorite platform. Leave us a review if you have a minute. We always like to hear what you have to say. And if you have any interesting topics you want us to cover, drop us a line. You can check us out on the website at sapientinsights.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of HR We Have a Problem. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.